It's now my pleasure to welcome back Marly Hornik to The Truth. She is an elections integrity expert and runs United Sovereign America. Marly, welcome.
Thanks, John. It's good to be back with you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You've got your hands full, don't you?
Yes, we took off a big chunk. We really at United Sovereign Americans, we have tens of thousands of volunteers engaged all over the country in research, advocacy, education, and litigation efforts. It's a beautiful machine of American love and patriotism.
So you started United Sovereign America with Harry Haury, who we had on our show a couple of months ago. We had both of you actually here in the studio, which was our pleasure. And you did this as an outgrowth of the 2020 elections, which you have been working on now for 4 years, as I understand it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is your purpose is not to relitigate 2020, just to make sure it never happens again.
Yes, we have been experiencing so many issues with our elections that continually get labeled glitches and they continually get labeled clerical errors. But in reality, the way that the Constitution defines our right to vote, we simply don't have room for potential breaches of security and potential lapses in integrity within our voting systems. And when those happen, no one has to trust the outcome. So fundamentally, United Sovereign Americans is seeking a legally valid 2024 general election. And we've spent several years designing a litigation strategy that ends with either total compliance or total accountability on the part of those state administrators responsible for helping congressional members reliably, meaning lawfully elected.
Well, you learned a lot from 2020 and the kind of built-in gotchas that were out there. So tell us how you're going to avoid the problems with the courts again in this go round that plagued us in the aftermath of 2020.
Often I find myself not able to describe our process end to end, but it starts very simply. Our teams of volunteer analysts who are experts in their field, credentialed experts in the fields of software development, data analytics, big data auditing, they run investigations of the statewide voter registration list in each state and the voter participation histories. That may sound pretty dull and all, but these two documents, sometimes they're combined into a single document and sometimes they're split, are actually federally recognized documents that constitute the official list of voters and the official list of participants according to all constitutional federal and state laws that exists in all of the world. It's the only one. So when this list is required by Congress to be accurate and current, and it's not, first of all, that doesn't represent an administrative failure. That represents a constitutional abridgment to the right to vote because Congress said it's necessary for these documents to be accurate. When we investigate these documents, we ask four basic, simple questions. Were the lists accurate? Were the votes counted from eligible citizen voters according to all state and federal law? Was the number of votes counted equal to the number of voters who voted? And did the states meet Congress's accuracy requirement for federal elections to be considered reliable? Inevitably, we discover in every state that we have audited, which is 21 states so far, representing over 338 electoral college votes, we discover that the states have miserably failed to uphold any of those principles of civil rights, protecting our choosing of representatives. So we report all of that to the state officials and to the federal officials who are required under law to investigate these issues as a matter of civil rights. When they fail to follow through on these investigations, our next step has been, and we've done this in 9 states already, to file federal lawsuits against these officials, both at the state and the federal level, who have clearly stood down on their duty to the American people to provide constitutionally reliable elections of representatives. When they fail to respond to these mandamus actions, and this is really the tricky part, a lot of people say, hey, Marly, these lawsuits that you filed in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Texas, Michigan, North Carolina, Colorado, and Georgia, they're too late. Well, the point was not to get these adjudicated before the 2024 election, though that would have been nice had we been able to file them back in January. But we filed them in May, or rather, we started in March and then in June and then in August. So the reality is what we have actually accomplished, which is massive. And you have to understand this is being done by citizens. The parties aren't doing this and they're not helping us. The government is not helping us. There is no one helping the citizens save their own country. So just want to say that's awesome. But what we did was we cracked the standing nut. You see, in the past, in federal courts, when citizens have alleged in advance of a federal election that their right to vote is about to be either denied or abridged in any way, which can include dilution of the vote through invalid votes procured through corruption, those citizens who have filed lawsuits to protect that right in advance of the election and have not been heard by the court has declined to adjudicate the matter or even hear the matter before that injury takes place. The citizens have automatic ironclad standing to file for injunctive relief on the basis of civil rights before those elections get certified. Basically, if the courts even fail the people have a right to demand that those elections are either audited end to end to assure that they comply with federal and state law and the constitutional offer to the citizens, the requirement that the citizens choose their representatives, or the elections themselves have historically been thrown out and the state has to do it again. Because if the election is unreliable as a matter of law, then the citizens cannot take the injury in equity. The state is the one who takes the injury. In the balance of interests, the state's interest in, administrative convenience does not outweigh the citizen's injury in denial of a fundamental civil right.
Well, you've given us a lot to unpack there. I break down the voting process. You may be able to help me refine this, but registration, voting, counting, recording, and certification. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, you basically summarized the four categories that we actually measure when we look at a state registration list: voters, votes, counts, and then our fourth is auditability. Because even going back to Patrick Henry, during the ratification debates for the United States Constitution in the state of Virginia on June 5th of 1788, Patrick Henry said, "Hey, if the administrators of the elections are allowed to hide records, they're going to claim that every record is secret and must be held in abeyance." So this is not a new problem. Election officials who don't want to talk about their process and don't want to let the American people see what they've done.
I think that's an important question right there. I don't think that necessarily government attracts the best and the brightest. I'm sorry. That's just that is my experience in having dealt with people at all levels of government. And so you attract people who are not the most motivated people in the world, and they look for the easy way out. And from my experience, government is never wrong about anything, even when it is blatant and in their face. So what you find, or what I've found in the Georgia case that I was involved with, is that the registration rolls were abysmal. We had people that were registered at UPS stores and homeless shelters and apartments that were abandoned. Well, we saw in Arizona that the voting process in 2022 was severely flawed. The machines were defective in many, if not most, Republican-leaning precincts. And then in Georgia, we also witnessed in 2020 that the recording of the votes were flawed, because we saw there were 5 ladies in the State Farm Arena that took 100 count ballots, which was a stack, and each stack was roughly 100, and they fed them through the same tabulator multiple times. And then we see 3,200 flagrantly duplicate ballots on the Secretary of State's own website. So we've got problems with who is registered, who is voting. how the votes are counted. So I take it that you are trying to impact each of those processes based on what I've heard you say.
That's exactly correct, John, because that's how the federal government defines election fraud. The corruption of the voter list, the votes themselves, the counts, and then the denial of transparency to the American people in reviewing what these states allege are the outcomes of elections. So when the registration list is corrupted, so I'll give you a couple of examples. When United Sovereign Americans audits the list, we find all kinds of problems like the ones you're identifying, but we look for different problems. We're not looking for issues where the it looks like the registration record, which was originally valid, has not been properly maintained and updated in a timely fashion by the state. We look for registration records that are facially invalid and illegal on that basis because only legally registered voters are allowed to be on that list by federal law. So in 20 states, United Sovereign Americans found 29 million registration records that are facially invalid and therefore illegal. These are people who, according to the only record that exists, are registered to vote before their birth. They are registered to vote after having participated sometimes in multiple federal elections. They are backdated in the registration rolls. So you look for them in 2021, and this unique ID and registration record doesn't exist. You look in 2022, it's there. It was supposedly created in 1984, and it has now voted in a federal election that is prior to its creation. These are junk data that indicate our voting systems are being breached somehow. Now, just like you, I have my suspicions about how this may be done, but I don't actually know. And you cannot get a legitimate investigation of these processes because the election officials refuse and the law enforcement agencies refuse. So the United Sovereign Americans litigation strategy is designed to get around all of that. Because out of those 29 million invalid registrations, there were 10 million votes counted in the 2022 midterm. That is a staggering amount of what the United States Department of Justice calls felony federal election fraud. In addition, those states counted 2 million more votes than they have any record of any voter participating, including our dear patriotic friend, Asterisk, who's registered in pretty much every state. So this is not okay. This is not a valid process. In any other industry, these systems would be thrown out. The states have an average 13% error rate in the counting of votes, where Congress has determined they are allowed to have a maximum of 0.0008% error in the counting of votes. This is not legitimate. And that's what our lawsuits aim straight at, just like you're saying. And this is not inside of the National Voter Registration Act, where they say, oh, if the registration record is improper, then you need to start sending them postcards and see if they respond within 4 years. And if they haven't responded in 4 years, then 4 years later, you can remove them from the list. You can make them inactive. But if they show up to the polls, you can hand them a ballot regardless. But this is not a legitimate process.